Welcome to this podcast and webcast in the History and Context of Journalism series at the University of Winchester. Today we have a second year topic, which is Sigmund Freud, and a lecture was given earlier today by my colleague Brian Thornton dealing with Freud, and we also viewed some art material, some art film from the period really when Freud was writing, the surrealist films of Louis Buñuel. So I'm going to ask Brian, by way of starting, what it is that's so important about Freud. I mean, why on our course do
we deal with him? Because studying journalism, studying the media, Freud is absolutely essential for an understanding of magazines, mainstream movies. Even the language that we use is Freudian. As his biographer said, we all speak Freud now. Whether we agree with what Freud said, whether we disagree, he's impossible to ignore, especially in the media. Everything is soaked in sort of Freudian terms. What I tried to explain today was the context of Freud, his main ideas, his opposition to sort of the ideas of Plato and the idea of Marx. Also, I did introduce quite a few criticisms of Freud, because Freud is an intensely controversial figure.
So, in this course, it's controversial to some. We unfold in a sort of apostolic succession of thinkers, really starting with what's called the Enlightenment normally. What's Freud's role within that? Is he a figure from the Enlightenment? How does he follow on, as it were, from some of the 19th century figures we've been looking at? Freud, of course, is concerned with the mind, with psychology. So we've looked at some other people like Kant, Hegel, and their idea of the mind. Does Freud fit within that?
Well, Freud did seem so very much as a scientist. So in that regard, you could view him as following on from the Enlightenment. But he is seen as in opposition to the Enlightenment, as a break with the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment was a view. If we think of somebody like Newton, the view was that through rationality, through our brains, we could in some way, even though we are a long way off, understand the universe. We had the capability, we had the potential, through scientific research, through empirical research, to understand everything and to bring it under control. What Freud is saying is, we were mistaken. This was the great mistake. We are not capable, in the way that we are built, in the way that we are, of ever controlling even ourselves. The universe, that sort of level of control was always beyond us, because we are at heart, in our very core, in conflict with ourselves.
In the lecture you did deal with a continuation in some ways from Plato, some of the Platonic themes to do with personality and mind, and also but a departure from Marx and so on. But can we move on to what Freud was actually saying about the personality himself? I think people following the course will be able to fill in those details. So let's talk now for a while about how Freud viewed people.
I think that I'll take your lead that we really don't want to open up the Plato and Marx again. That's for another day. But I think that we must just mention that Freud did follow the idea of the tripartite self, the idea that the soul or the self or the personality is split into three distinct parts. The three parts that he outlines are: one, the id; number two, the ego; and number three, the superego. It's interesting that we almost feel obliged to mention the id first, and this is consistent with Freudian ideas. He describes the id in a memorable phrase as the cauldron of seething excitations. Essentially, it's all our instincts, our desires, our needs, and for Freud, he saw it as the fusion of two of the real drives in us as people, as sex and aggression. And the id was a fusion of these two, and it was constantly, unstoppably demanding these needs be satisfied. He was looking for satisfaction all the time, and it is insatiable.
A bit like a baby, it strikes me. That the id is really the baby stage. That, you know, when we grow up, we lose our milk teeth and so on, but we never quite lose the mentality of being a baby, and that's expressed in the id. Is that right? Is that?
Yeah, this is a symbol that people often use. It's like a child having a tantrum. They will not listen to reason. They will not be reasoned to. They will not. The rationality is just gone. All they want is satisfaction. I want. It's relentless. The key thing that we must remember with Freud is saying this is the dominant part of our personality.
And what's wrong with that? I mean, in clinical terms, I mean, why shouldn't people just be in that sort of wanting condition? Is it because that leads to unhappiness in some way?
Well, it depends which way you want to approach it. But in Freudian terms, if we look at it purely in Freudian terms, is that Freud saw these as uncontrollable, dangerous, negative, detrimental to us, detrimental to society. This is why Freud thinks that we should repress these. And this is why in his treatment of patients, what he tries to do is boost the ego. The ego is our sort of rational selves.
Okay, so that's the second stage, as I understand. So we have this kind of inner child, as you'll see that in tabloid newspapers talking about their inner child and so forth, and comedy comes from being in touch with your inner child, etc. But then as people grow, or they develop in a healthy way, a fairly healthy way, I think that Freud doesn't see anybody as purely healthy. Everybody is in need of his medicine. We'll perhaps come to that, his psychoanalysis. But as we grow, as I understand it, the theory is we develop the second and third parts of the personality. Is that right?
The ego develops very early on, but the superego is the third part. This is not with us when we're born.
So with the ego first, as I understand it, the ego is the sense of the self. I mean, a baby doesn't necessarily know who it is. It just has these wants and needs, which it gets very frightened by if they're not immediately satisfied. But as the ego stage, as it's called, kicks in about 2 or 3 normally in Freudian terms, the terrible twos, as it's called, when the person, as I understand it, develops a sense of their self. And that comes into conflict with the id. Is that right?
Yeah, that's largely why Freud was arguing that this is a time of sort of great conflict within the person. Why you will have these tantrums? Why? Because this is the beginning of a lifelong process, a lifelong battle between the ego and the id. Because it's the ego's attempt to try and control the id, in Freudian terms, for good or for ill.
In the lecture, you mentioned sex, but quite a bit, but I think also defecation comes into this, because prior to, in the id phase, the child just defecates at will, and that's why you need nappies and things for them. But the ego stage is also about controlling so-called toilet training. And then a third element, which comes in to make them do the toilet training, which is the parents or the social convention that you can't just defecate wherever you like and so forth. Is that right? Was that what you meant by the superego things?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, in Freudian terms, what happens is a child will progress through these different stages, but there is a great danger that somebody may become stuck in a certain stage, in the anal stage, and then this is come into common sort of conversational language. So and so is anal.
Well, they're a control freak. They fear following their natural instincts because they think they'll be punished for it.
Yeah. And then there's oral fixation. This is from the bottle, from the mother's milk and so on. So
it's often said that smoking, for example, is a sublimation of being on the nipple and so on. People don't derive the pleasure from taking horrible fumes in their thing, but it's the whole act of sucking.
Yeah. I mean, sublimation is worth mentioning, I think, at this stage. Sublimation is, Freud argues that there are ways to control these sort of these needs.